In this lesson, we're going to learn a little bit more about strings. So in our previous lessons, we learned about the print function. So when we say print, whatever we put in side of the parentheses for the print command, so for example, if we say hello, well, let's do hello world, inside of quotation marks in that print statement, when we run, it's going to print it on the console in the shell. So here comes our Python shell, and there's our output, hello world. Okay, strings also can be printed out that way with single quotes as opposed to double quotes. Okay, see how that is going to do the same thing. They're both green inside of there. Okay, you can alternately assign your string to a variable. So we could say message equals hello world, and then we could print the variable as the argument message. Okay, and that would do the same thing. It would output hello world to the shell when we run it. Now, if we want our string message to output inside of the Minecraft world, okay, there's a function that we can use to do that. And instead of the print, right, which prints to the shell in idle, we're going to do world.post to chat, and that's camel case. So the T is capitalized, the C is capitalized. And then we'll pass our message as the argument to that function. So now when we come up here and run, and we look at our Minecraft, there's the message, hello world. And notice it's printing inside of Minecraft as opposed to over here in the shell. Okay, so to make this a little easier to see, I'm going to pull my shell down, resize it a little bit here, and I'm going to put that under my Minecraft world so that they're sort of stacked one on top of the other. And we'll pull this across so that we can see what's happening in the shell without disrupting our Minecraft view. Okay, so now say I don't want to have to type my message directly into my Python code. I want the user to be able to tell me what the message is that they want to paste into the chat. So I'm going to say message is equal to the input, and then we're going to give the user a prompt. So we'll say, what is your message? And then we close the parentheses, and whatever the user types in the console, that is going to be retrieved and stored in the variable message. And then we're going to post that message to the chat. So let's go ahead and run. Okay, and we can see down here in the shell, what is your message? And we'll say, hello world, and then we press enter, and there's our message displayed in the Minecraft world. Okay, now if you want a space, notice that the hello that the user typed is right up against the question mark in your prompt. If you want to space that a little differently, you'll need to add some spaces inside of the string literal, inside of the quotation marks. Okay, so let's go ahead and run that again. Okay, so now what is your message? So we can say, my name is Steve. Press enter, and there's the message displayed in the Minecraft world like we were expecting. Okay, so this time let's change the variable message to be first name, and we'll ask the user, what is your first name? Okay, and then let's copy that line of code and we'll paste it right underneath. and we'll change this one to be the last name. And we'll ask the player, what is your last name? Now, if I want to output a message to the chat welcoming this player, I could start with a string literal and say welcome, comma, space, and then I'm going to close the quotation marks, and then I'm going to use a plus sign. And that plus, when you're working with strings, is called concatenation. It's going to concatenate or join together the strings before and after the plus sign. So we'll have their first name displayed, plus, and if I were to just put the last name right after the first name, it would concatenate those together with no extra space between, right? It would look like their name was in camel case. So before I output their last name, I'm going to go ahead and add a space in between. So I'm going to join up welcome, comma, space, then the first name, then a space, then the last name. Okay, so let's go ahead and run and take a look at what that looks like. So we're asked in the shell, what is your first name? So we'll say Steve, and last name, Minor, and it welcomes Steve Minor. Okay, so now let's ask our player for how many cows they have. So we'll assign this to the variable cows, and we'll input how many cows do you have. Okay, and that's a string literal inside of our input, and it's going to save what they type as cows. Okay, let's go ahead and do the same thing, but this time we'll count their sheep. So how many sheep, how many sheep do you have? Okay, and then let's see if we're able to add together their cows and their sheep. So we'll do world post to chat again. So we'll go ahead and copy this to make that a little faster. So we're going to post to the chat, you have space, okay, that'll end our string literal, plus, and then let's add together cows plus sheep. Okay, we'll put that in parentheses so the order of operations does that operation first. And then we'll concatenate on a space, animals, okay, and then close to that post to chat function. So if the user is typing in a number, what we want to figure out by doing this is Python storing that number as an integer, or is Python storing that number as a string the way that it did with the first and last name? So if Python is storing them as numbers, it will treat this operation as addition, and it would add the numbers. But if Python is actually storing them as strings, even though the user is typing in numbers, then it would treat that plus sign as concatenation and just join the numbers, not actually add them. So let's go ahead and test it, and we'll see what Python's doing. So our first name is Steve, last name is Minor. How many cows do we have? We have 3 cows. How many sheep? We have 5 sheep. And it tells me in the chat I have 35 animals. So that shows me that cows and sheep, even though the user was typing in integers, they were being stored as strings in the memory. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and clean up my prompt here, add a space afterwards, well, maybe 2 spaces, there we go, to make it more readable. And now I want to figure out how to make these be numbers, right, instead of strings, so that I can add them rather than concatenate them. So in front of each of these variables, I'm going to cast them as integers. I'm going to type int in front of them, and that should convert the string then into a number. Okay, now we're going to have a problem though when we have a number plus a number, because I can't concatenate a number with a string. So out front of these parentheses, we're then going to need to cast that result, the number that is added together, as a string, so that it can be joined into our output statement. So let's go ahead and run. Oh, I've got an invalid syntax. Okay, I see what I did. I'm doing Java here instead. So I need to put the parentheses around the variable to cast it instead of around int. So now we're going to cast the cows variable as an int, and then the same thing for the sheep, right? We're going to turn these parentheses around. And then we've got our cows cast as an integer, sheep cast as an integer. We're going to add those numbers together, and then we can cast that result as a string. Okay, so for Python, the parentheses go around the variable being cast, and rather than the data type it's being cast to. So let's go ahead and run that. Okay, first name in the shell is Steve, last name Minor. How many cows do we have? 5. How many sheep do we have? 8. And there's our total. You have 13 animals. Okay, now if I didn't want to do my casting inside of my post to chat function, I could cast them right here when we grab them as input. So if I put the int out front of my input statement, right, same thing for sheep, we're going to cast that string input that gets captured, cast it as an int. Now cows and sheep are already integers. So in my excuse me, in my message that I'm going to post to the chat, now I can just add together the cows plus the sheep, because this will be an integer plus an integer. But then I still need to cast that integer as a string so that I can concatenate that output when it gets posted to the chat. Okay, now whenever we have the player inputting values, we are subject to issues when they don't understand what we want from them. So for instance, if I run this, okay, and I'm asking for the first name, so Steve, last name Minor. What if Steve tells me he has 2 cows, TWO, instead of entering a number? So when I press enter, now that's going to stop the program and throw an error, invalid literal for int with base 10, right? A literal is a string. So because the user entered a string, 3 letters, and I tried to cast that as an integer to save it as cows, that can't happen, right? So we get an error. So to avoid those types of errors, we can use what's called a try except. So before we start to capture this data, we're going to type the word try followed by a colon. And then we're going to grab the number of cows, okay? And then we'll say except, so that if an error is thrown, now we can tell it what to do instead. And we're going to print invalid, okay, please enter a number. Okay, and now when we run, we'll type in Steve's first name, his last name. How many cows do we have? If he types the word 2, it says invalid, please enter a number. Okay, so that try except is the first example that we've had so far of indentation in Python. So when you have an indentation, right, and it generally will follow a colon. So when we get to loops, for instance, you'll see this indentation again. Whenever we want a block of code to happen, we're going to indent it so that it's triggered or executed by the command that's not indented. So the try is going to try what we put underneath of it, okay? And then the exception is if this throws an error, this will get printed instead. Okay, so let's put our sheep back up here. Okay, and now we've got our try that has two things indented underneath. So let's put in Steve and minor. And this time we'll put in a number, right, for the cows. And notice it tried it and it took it. It was fine. So now we go down to sheep. If I input sheep as a word, there I get my invalid, please enter a number. Okay. Now, when we get into conditional statements, we'll see how we can get past that so we can trigger the opportunity for the user to correct their mistake, right? But for now, we're just looking at the basics of the try except.